today. Welcome to students, teachers, and those of you interested in American politics and the Constitution and American life. Welcome to our discussion here with the 4Bs and off the cuff, we like to call it. Today we have, again, a special guest. We've had him on our program before with us from the University of Richmond Law School, Professor Hank Chambers, who we've just been talking a lot about college sports and the recent Supreme Court decision, which is maybe a good topic down the road to talk about. There is the economics of the American Constitution and what kind of boundaries and are set up in that. But today we're going to look at race education and the First Amendment. Kind of big, all right. I think Professor Moore and Kavanaugh remember a colleague of ours who once said that First Amendment's really huge there. So maybe this topic's maybe a little bit much, but we'll see how we handle it. I will say for me personally, as an educator for over 35 years, race has always, in my mind, been America's Achilles heel, the cancer of American, identity, the third rail that we just, as a nation, have been unable to address and converse about. And in recent months, it is once again at the very forefront of at least the political conversation. Talking about wokeness and this idea of critical race theory. And these issues have captured the attention, at least of the media. I don't know how many Americans really are talking about this, but I can definitely tell you that CNN, MSNBC, and probably Fox are all over this. And I think Fox in the month of June so far has mentioned critical race theory at least 500 times, I read this morning there. So it's obviously a big issue for many Americans. Looking at this from a history perspective, history is politics by other means. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last time that we have controversy when it comes to what we are asked to teach our kids, whether it be K through 12 or the university level there, because this issue involves all of them. So I want to start off with our guest, Professor Chambers, and so to make sure that we're all kind of using the same vocabulary. And if you could, to us and to our audience, can you explain as simply as possible what critical race theory is?
Sure. Let me give you truly the simplest vision. And I see the smile going across Tim Moore's face because he's thinking, oh, this could be a while. No, it actually is going to be really short. The basic concept behind critical race theory is that we ought to consider the past racism of America and how it continually perpetuates itself today. And if you think of that as being the very basic notion behind critical race theory, you realize how simple it really is. Right? The idea is, can we please just talk about the role that race continues to play in American society in the same way that we could talk about the role that sex continues to play in American society? In the same way that we could consider how being poor continues to play in American society. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are attacking America, and I'm not viewing myself as being a critical race theorist necessarily, although a lot of the things I write might be considered kind of critical. But the idea that we would think about the role that those pieces have played historically and continue to play just strikes me as being the way to think about engaging in critical thought. So and if we think of it that way, it's a little easier.
My understanding, this really started somewhere it was in the 70s, really at the law school level, and then it's
right.
All right, but it's I don't know when. I'm trying to remember who's the professor. Oh gosh, pretty famous guy, Bell.
Yeah, we got Derrick. Derrick Bell, Mari Matsuda, Chuck Lawrence. Kimberly Crenshaw, lots of folks sort of thinking about the role that race has played and continues to play, sometimes almost invisibly in society. But I do want to be fair about this. They put a name to it, and it's no surprise that it started in law schools because it talked about how the law has race and racism embedded in it. So yeah, that was always going to be a law school thing. But my guess is that when we think about lots of issues, we would pretty quickly and pretty easily recognize critical race theory concepts everywhere. And indeed, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you all taught these kinds of critical race theory ideas without even realizing it, because of the simple notion that all we're really looking at is how race perpetuates itself in American law and in American society.
I know this is dangerous, but I've been both watching and reading a lot of material here, and either you or anybody else, how did this theory become associated with Marxism? Because a lot of the critics from the political sphere, which again, the disingenuousness of those in the political sphere is wide and deep there, but it's associated in a lot of places with Marxism. Is that a legitimate concern?
I'm not a big Marx guy. Whether it's Karl or Groucho. So I'm not a huge Marx guy. But the idea, I think, is that if one argues that the current system has problems, then sometimes the solution is a radical one that may look like Marxism. So I'm sure there's some people who are devotees of critical race theory who then think about Marxism, but I don't think one has to be a Marxist in order to look at critical race theory. I mean, I, for example, say, well, of course, critical race theory has tons to teach us about ourselves, our history, and our future, but I'm nobody's Marxist. Marx would go, please, that guy? I don't think so. Das Kapital? That guy's capital. So I think the way it essentially gets related is because folks want to put a boogeyman on top of it and say, well, if some of the people who are for it are about Marx, then that's what it is. I've heard the same things about Black Lives Matter, right? Well, you don't have to be a Marxist to think that Black Lives Matter, right? So,
yeah. Professor Williams, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing. I mean, what I was reading, getting ready for this, is the historical analogy of the calls in the 1930s to not teach Marxism in schools, right? Because it was going to teach a theory that we thought was going to be dangerous for young people to be thinking about. I see that equivalency in the critique, but if we're just being super dorky social scientists here, right? A Marxist puts on their glasses and they see the world through class. There's nothing, it's the exact opposite with critical race theory. You put on glasses and you see the world through race. Now, critical race theory does talk about this notion of intersectionality, right? Of course, there's going to be some intersection. So if that's what commentators, if they're putting them together, they're actually practicing something that we call intersectionality, which is a good thing, I think. I think we should be thinking about that. But to call a critical race theorist a Marxist, I just think that you're just trying to play with boogeymen there. You're trying to scare people, I think.
So
I think,
go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder some of the association with Marxism has to do with, I mean, the Marxist framework is haves versus have-nots, and this dialectic struggle where the oppressed are in constant tension with those that aren't oppressed. So I think it was an easy. I suspect it's an easy leap for many people to say, well, critical race theory deals with race, and there's always been many disparities in our society between the races. So I think it's an easy jump when you use the oppressed versus the haves versus the have-nots for it to be associated. And I also there's this notion out there too that a critique of it is that they the old unrepentant Marxists, they lost the economic argument of Marxism, so they've moved it now to cultural issues, and they're using that. So they lost the economic argument. Capitalism wins. Can we still maintain some framework of analysis? And they've moved it into the cultural domain.
So this question is kind of to all of you, whoever wants to jump on it. So my understanding is this starts at law school. All right. It has, metastasized, if that's a word that it's appropriate here, into undergraduate and graduate schools beyond law school. My understanding, there's specific programs at a lot of universities, but it's still the university level there. So the real controversy seems to be K through 12. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective and your understanding, has this theory, in your opinion, weaved its way somehow into K through 12 education? And if so, how has that, how did that happen? Who wants to jump on? Because Kavanaugh, you got a cheesy cat kind of grin on your face.
Any kid that's ever sat, and any of the thousands of kids that have ever sat in any of my history courses have heard me say this: the history of the United States is a history of racism and sexism. Or you could say the history of the United, if you want to think in a positive light, the history of the United States is a history of overcoming racism and sexism. So you can't, I from the jump, I start with that, right? So I don't know if that's critical race theory. I've got a sneaking suspicion that I've been teaching that the ideas of it for a long time, like and one of the proponents of CRT, as I understand it, and I say this all the time to my students: race is a man-made concept. Race, we've established racial, identities. That's not part of the Genome Project. So we're this whole concept of race is a man-made concept, and so we're debating about black, white, different shades in between, and all the mixtures that make us great. This is all man-made, and as I understand her critical race theory, that's one of the major proponents of it. That it's not a biological, certainty. So I probably have been teaching.
Well, I think the conservatives saw this Project 1619.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
As I think that was a critical moment. I mean, to your question, David, why K to 12? I think that publication really sped up the dialogue. That's the way I would see it.
Is it because they created lessons to be taught?
Yeah.
And that was announced in the New York Times, as well as, these are these lessons, and you
Right.
think that's the spark?
Yeah, I do. And also, we all know that Americans are always kind of sensitive to national top-down curriculums too. So I think the issue of race within the 1619 Project, combined with this, is this a top-down imposition into our local, our local control of our schools? So I think there's probably two things going on with Project 1619 there.
So I think you raise a good question. I think Tim's right. Here's part of the problem. If we're going to expect kids to think critically, we have to expect ourselves to think critically. And and I'm not going to blame any group, any side, or what have you. But what is a bit problematic and unfortunate about the fight over the 1619 and the 1776 projects is that we could have done so much more to think our way through this issue. And I'll give you a couple of examples, and I hope so that in case folks are starting to ask, well, how does the rubber really meet the road on these things? Let me just throw out two pieces of the puzzle around 1619 and around 1776. 1619, we have 20 odd Africans come to we're not going to say the United States because we weren't the United States, but to the continent. Okay, fine. What happened after that? Recognize that a lot of the folks who came early actually became free. There have been free Africans in the United States almost since 1619. What happened, though, was that slavery became racialized relatively early in that process. It didn't have to become racialized. There are stories from the 1600s where you have Africans who are free because they've worked off their indenture or what have you, who are in the society. We didn't have to take the path that we took, but slavery became racialized. And one of the ways that it became racialized was by asking or by deciding that children of mixed race couples were going to end up taking the slavery status or the bondage status of the mother instead of the father. So white father, enslaved mother, child becomes enslaved. That raises a whole different set of stakes to what's going on, right? It didn't have to work that way. It could have been that the child of a white father and a enslaved mother could have been born free. That would have changed the way we thought about race, slavery, etc. So that's one of the things that we could have learned from the 1619 project. That is not to say that the 1619 project didn't mention it, but that's something that we could have learned. So that's one, right? That we had a choice, and a choice was made regarding how the issue or how the children of mixed race folks were going to be dealt with. How does that get to 1776? Well, what I want you to do, and here I always say, yes, I'm a proud graduate of the University of Virginia, so anything that sounds bad about Thomas Jefferson, hey, put it to the side. Let's go to Monticello. Let's go to Monticello in the late 1760s, 1770s, right around 1776. Those folks who now know who Sally Hemings is, okay? Some folks still don't recognize that Sally Hemings was the half sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. You say, whoa, how's that possible? Because you've had people engaging in cross-racial sex for lots and lots of years. But it's even deeper than that, because you may go, oh, well, okay, no big deal. It turns out that Sally Hemings's mother was the biracial child of an English sea captain and an enslaved woman in America. So let's be real clear about this. Sally Hemings was essentially 1/4 Black, African. That means that her children with Thomas Jefferson were essentially 7/8 white. Go to Monticello in your mind. You have a number of children roaming around Monticello who are 7/8 white and look probably somewhat like Thomas Jefferson. What does race mean at that point? There are choices that could have been made. The choices were to guarantee that Sally Hemings remained enslaved. That was a choice. Is that choice still a choice that haunts us today? Of course it does. It haunts us in the writing of the Declaration of Independence, because now you got to ask, okay, the guy who drafted the Declaration of Independence with all that stuff in it also had a lot of folks on his mountaintop plantation who looked almost white to quite dark. What is he thinking about the concept of race and what race means in America moving forward? And how does he become the guy who also writes the notes on the state of Virginia, which has a whole lot of really ugly stuff about race? Race has been a choice in America since 1619. I don't care whether you call it slavery or not, but race has been a choice, and it has been embedded in the law since 1619. That's not a critical race Marxist thing. That's just history. So when folks talk about critical race theory, all I ask is, well, if you want to teach history from a critical perspective, it's really hard to not teach critical race theory. Kavanaugh's been doing it for years. Luckily, he's been doing it undercover because people are coming for you now, Chris. But I'll stop there for a moment and let other folks jump in.
Mike?
To your point on the racialization of slavery, part of that is because Native Americans who they tried to enslave early didn't work. I mean, if you think about that too, I mean, because I teach in an area now that we have a pretty big Native population. We make sure we talk about that. The idea that what happens when the Europeans show up and the attempted enslavement of Native people and how that worked out, which it didn't. So the reliance on African slavery then takes hold.
Absolutely. So it's all. So it gets. In fact, we'll bring it all the way. I said I was going to let folks jump in. I swear I will let folks jump in just a moment. Just to note, of course, that early in Virginia, we had the story of Pocahontas / Rebecca. And the notion was, ooh, what are we going to do here? We had intermixing explicitly to make sure that bloodlines were mixed. And indeed, the Randolph crew of the Jefferson family were claimed to be, they look kind of dark, right? Because the notion was we recognized that there was Indian blood in that group because they could trace themselves back to Pocahontas. Recognize that in the anti-miscegenation laws that were on the books in Virginia that were overturned in Loving, the exceptions that were out there were there for folks who could trace their lineage back to Pocahontas. So you're not supposed to have any intermarriage except if you could trace yourself back to Pocahontas, because the Pocahontas story is one that we all supposed to love because it tells us about how great we are. The issue of race has been around forever. It's nobody's fault that if you're going to engage in critical thinking, you're going to think critically about race. And if you think critically about race, you've got the critical, the race, and the only thing left is theory, and theory is not a bad thing. So it's hard for me to do anything other than say, you can call it what you want, but all we're really asking for is for people to think deeply about history, politics in the United States of America.
Professor
Well,
Williams?
I'd like to jump in on Hank's point. I think it's really critical to understand that I think in American education, for better or worse, and sometimes it's been for worse, we view education as a catechism. And the catechism principle is American exceptionalism. And so when you, so when someone comes along with a curriculum that says, "Hey, wait a minute, we're all not that, we are not all that in a bag of chips," that challenges this notion of American exceptional. Like, I mean, when you mentioned the Pocahontas, that whole story, that's a great story, right? It proves that we are exceptional and we're wonderful, and so I think Hank's point about American exceptionalism is really, I think, central to this debate about 1619. It really challenges that notion, and I would suggest any curriculum that comes along and challenges. I mean, we saw this starting in the 80s when people wanted to, make all of the founders good, virtuous Christians, and so I think the exceptionalism component in American education is critical to understanding the visceral response to some of these things.
Professor Williams?
Yeah, and I agree with all this. I would add to what everyone's saying, to Hank's point about 1619 and the choice. I always teach my students that most choices are constrained, right? You're constrained by your imagination, the laws, what your experience is. And we have to go back to the 1450s. The first travel journals written by the Portuguese justifying the Atlantic slave trade. And they wrote about Africans as being less than white humans. It was about power. It was about these Catholic Portuguese have to justify, how do you go and kidnap people from their homes, bring them to another place and force them to work for you. So to some extent in 1619, the structures are already built. Of course, we have examples of ways out of it, but the structure is built to think about blacks from Africa as being less than. And the other point I'd make, just moving up to 1776, is the point about Thomas Jefferson obviously cared for some individual Black human beings, right? He cared for them. So, but he was still in a racist society. And I would argue, to the extent that he loved Sally Hemings, but thought that Blacks as a group were less than, that's the point of critical race theory, that racism is not about individuals, it's about the structure. And so when critical race theory might call out a white male like myself and say, you may be inherently racist, it's not that Mike Williams is racist. It's that Mike Williams, as a white male in America, in our culture, in our history, I should be aware of the fact of the privilege that I have draped all around me, whether I like it or not. I can't undrape myself of that privilege that has been with me since 1619, that goes all the way back to the 1450s. So these choices that we make as a society are there, but they're very constrained by this other baggage that we have from 400 or 500 years ago.
And Mike, you've got, of all of us here, I believe you have the youngest kids. And I just kind of want to bring to a close that one topic. Do you accept the notion that this has leaked into K through 12 education? And I guess I'm asking you because your sons are what, eighth grade, seventh grade level. Have you seen any sign of this ominous critical race theory in your children's education? So kind of a two-part. Have you seen any signs? And secondly, do you accept the premise out there, especially amongst those who are very critical of critical race theory, that it's leaked into K through 12 in a significant way?
Yeah, my boys just finished up sixth grade this year. It might be because of COVID, David, but I haven't seen anything that screams out critical race theory, to be honest. If anything, they're getting it from home in terms of thinking through important ideas about what they see in terms of individuals in society, whether they be white, Black, or brown, needs to be seen through a lens of what has happened to groups of people over time. But as of right now, they're getting more of that from home than I think they are from school.
Well, as I said in the opening, I mean, again, I'm just shocked at the
David,
number.
Chris had a thought, David.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I'm sorry. Thanks, Tim. I forgot I was muted. Traffic outside. It's actually a beautiful day here, so I wanted to open up the windows. But it goes back to what Professor Chambers said earlier, and listening to you, Mike, and talking about your kids. And we're all teachers, and we always want our students to think critically. We want them to we want to develop critical thinkers, not what to think, but how to take an idea and examine that idea from all the way around it. And this is all that really, as I understand CRT, this is what they've done with race and how it's worked its way into the systems, Mike, that you were describing, right? The idea that it's worked itself into law. Can I hold up a book now, or am I forbidden from holding up a book?
You have never been forbidden.
Well,
but we will make fun of you.
For anybody that watches this, I would recommend this. This is an excellent book by Rothstein. And I was just in Montana over the weekend. I was reading about some places in Montana where you wouldn't expect some of the things to occur that occurred in terms of zoning and those types of things. So anyway, but I think critical is important. We just want kids to think critically, period.
Right. So let me do this, because this is an issue that I raised with folks a fair amount, because it becomes a way of thinking about critical race theory that gets away from the idea that there's individual blame and talks about structure. So you held up Rothstein's book, Robert Rothstein's book, The Color of Law.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He talks a lot about housing, a lot about zoning, etc. So let's ask this question in the most caricaturish way possible. Is eminent domain inherently racist? Now, there are going to be some folks who look up and go, I can't believe you're asking that question. That question is it's mean, it's wrong. What if I happen to be a lawyer who needs to condemn property? What if I'm the government? Calm down. Here's the thing to consider. Eminent domain is right there in our Constitution. It seems to be there for a pretty good reason. That is to say, we know that people are going to own property. We know that there are going to be times when the government needs to take property in order for the public good. Okay, so we understand that sometimes the rights of government override the rights of individuals. But now let's ask the question. We need to have an interstate highway system. Where are we going to put the highways? Well, one question we ask is, well, where can we put the highways and how much is it going to cost us? Eminent domain says you can take the property, but you got to pay fair market value for the property. What does that mean? It means we're going to look up and say, if we need to build a road, we're going to build a road in the most economical way possible. And part of that is getting land that's cheap. Who lives on land that's cheap? And why do they live on land that's cheap? Now, I am not saying that eminent domain necessarily means that policymakers don't like Black people or poor people, including my brothers and sisters who are poor in white, poor in yellow, poor in red, et cetera, and so forth. What it means, though, is that through the very colorblind way of thinking about how to build something cheaply, we're going to end up hitting people who are poor in part because of choices that we've made structurally that guaranteed that they were going to be poor. Namely, we let them be enslaved for a long time. Then after we pulled out of that, we had a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that were not actually viewed as being anti-subordination and instead were deemed colorblind. Then we had Jim Crow. Then we had to wait a long time until we had Title VII, which still has not always done all that it could. We've also had laws that allowed people to burn stuff down, whether it's the Tulsa race riot, which no one was punished for, what have you. So when we look at a society and we say, oh, gee, a lot of the folks who are marginalized, maybe people who are brown, people who are Black, they're not marginalized just because they happen to be Black or white, or at least, let's say, they're not marginalized because of their own endowments. They're marginalized because of what society has done. Now, take that as being the structure and lay eminent domain on top of that. And what are you going to do? You're going to buy the cheapest houses around. Some poor white folks are going to get hurt. Some poor Black folks are going to get hurt. Of course, we have Black neighborhoods because that's where we allow Black people to live. Go back to the color of law and Rothstein, right? So you add those things together and you say, yeah, at the end of the day, no one's saying that an eminent domain decision is necessarily racist, but it should be no surprise if the people who get hurt are going to be predominantly brown and Black. Or if you want to throw in the Marxist piece, poor white folks as well. That's just structure. And that's just thinking about structure. No one is saying that anybody in particular is racist. We're saying the system, given the role that race has played, means that today that racism is going to be perpetuated. I don't find that to be all that surprising. Now, we can ask how we solve that problem, right? I mean, is the solution to say, no, let's go build the highway through rich white people's areas? Okay, I mean, if that's your solution, okay. But at the very least, let's recognize that when we start to think about eminent domain and taking people's property, we're going to tend to take the property of people who have been downtrodden for a long time, because that's how they ended up in the poorest places, whether they're white, Black, red, or green. But in this country, oftentimes they're Black or brown, and that's not just dumb luck. That's the perpetuation of historical racism. I just don't find that to be all that controversial. And in fact, I suspect a lot of the conservatives wouldn't find that to be terribly controversial if you lay it out that way. Now, they're not necessarily happy with what you do next, but getting to that point is just not controversial, I don't think. But maybe I'm wrong.
Mike?
Yeah, that was brilliant. I just want to point out to people watching this that, in social science, and this is what critical race theory is, it comes from law and social science. Theory does not mean truth. Theory are a set of assumptions and definitions that then you apply evidence to and you make arguments. And what Professor Chambers just did.
You got to call me Hank because that sounds like there's a lot of hierarchy, and you can't do hierarchy with critical race theory.
What Hank just laid out was it was a perfect way to do the analysis. It was brilliant. And what I always tell my students is think about like any issue you want to think about. Like why is there traffic on the freeways in San Diego at 5 o'clock? What's your theory? Is your theory that people don't live where they work? Is your theory that our public transportation system is bad? Well, whatever theory, pick it, put on those glasses, and then test it, right? So the counter to critical race theory is that, no, it's not about the structure, it's about individual prejudice. And the problem with the red lines was that we had a bunch of people that were more prejudiced making policies in the 1930s than we do now. If that's the theory you want to put on, then I would encourage you to put on those glasses and test it, right? Critical race theory may not explain every issue that we are trying to understand around race. Colorblind theory might work, but it's not a truth, it's an analysis. And to the extent that anyone wants us to not be teaching students, whether K through 12, university or law students, different theories, that's the same issue we had 100 years ago with Marxism, right? That we just don't want to teach it because it scares us. And we should be better than that as a society. We should not be afraid of ideas and afraid to test theories, which is what critical race theory is trying to do, what Hank just demonstrated.
Yeah, and Mike just said it exactly the way I would say it. Yep.
So, man, there's about 1,000 things swirling there. I want to go back to something Chris said. Chris, you said, and again, you're right, we're all educators, maybe at different levels, but I know that Hank's, been in high school classrooms. Mike's been in high school classrooms. Don't know if you've been in middle school and elementary there, but we're all educators. And Chris, you said we all just want to get kids to critically think. Is it possible in your mind, Chris, that there are some educators that that's not their goal?
Oh, yeah.
That their goal is to impose?
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Okay. And is that, and I'm wondering, Tim and Chris, Tim especially, we have this joke, you guys like, I'm from California, and I'm not part of real America. Those of you in in Indiana, North Dakota, Wisconsin, you're real America. So
that's right.
Speaking on behalf of real America, why, and it's not about the politicians. I understand why the politicians are doing what they're doing, and then this is as old as politics. My surprise is this seems to resonate, all right, with a large number, maybe not a majority, but a large number of people. So I'm wondering, why do you think it resonates so much with real America?
Well, I think Tim said it best earlier, is that when you start challenging the concept of American exceptionalism, and you hold up that mirror to people, they don't necessarily like the image. So,
and the curriculums are coming from the left coast and the right coast.
Yeah.
So there's this coastal thing component. There's this cultural thing too.
Yeah.
I really did. And I also would, we all, I think, have read enough to know that there's different theories of civic education. There is a flavor of civic education that's very activist in its outcomes. And so I think those folks who see civic ed as acquiring knowledge about our institutions, about our history, I think they recoil at any kind of curriculum that's outcomes is creating student activists. And I think there's, and frankly, I think that may be a valid criticism, I think, of some of the variations of the 1619 and other things like it. I think it's rooted in a civic education theory that wants student activists, and I think there's a natural fear. What I don't know if that's the right word, but it doesn't fit a certain paradigm of how people perceive civic education to be done best.
Well, I think that they like the idea of, I think some people like the idea necessarily of activism. It just depends on the shade of activism, right?
Exactly.
And I think of College Board when they reworked the AP government curriculum, their curriculum for AP government, advanced placement government. They put into it a piece that was going to require some type of put quotes around activism. So you see that coming forward with folks, but it's just like, well, we want, here's my allusion to Marxism. We all want activism. Not all activism is created equally for you animal farm lovers. Okay.
Well, yeah, and then by the way, it was. I know you're right, Chris. It's activism. It was called civic engagement.
Yes.
They were going to the cornerstones of what everybody understands is good civic education, and one of that is engagement. But you're right, that got labeled as activism on the left there, and Terry was on that committee there. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, it's a great point, because now we're getting into the theory of what is the purpose of education, right? And I think I would put myself in the camp that I'm not there just for students to learn facts. I'm there for students to become active, critical citizens, right? But not all, that's just the view I have of education. And if you go into it with that kind of view, then yeah, you're dealing with a theory of change. Like it's got to be in your background. And if your theory of change in America is that, look, yeah, slavery is awful. It was our original sin, but we've been getting better and better. The story of America is the story of the opening up, the becoming more inclusive. And all we need to do is for all these prejudiced people to die. Once they're gone, we're going to be this wonderful non-racist society. That is a theory of change. And I would invite people watching this and students to test that. Like, is that theory of change hold up? Critical race theory would say, no, the problem isn't about individual prejudice. The problem is about the structures that we all inherit, whether we like it or not. And then that's where I think the debates happen. That's where you really, it's hard to come to terms because you're dealing with different ways that you see change happening. And I think those are legitimate conversations to have, but I think they should be evidence-based.
So let me throw out something that just to have fun and be controversial, right? What would we say about the new Juneteenth holiday? Now, I have been annoying the daylights out of my wife in the last couple weeks because I keep getting mad when folks say Juneteenth is about the celebration of the end of slavery, because it drives me absolutely berserk. Why? Because the argument becomes, depending on how you make it, the argument becomes Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, which we know is not true. We just know it. But the easy story to tell is the Union officers showed up on June 19th, 1865 to Galveston, Texas to sell slaves that they were free based on the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, there are a couple things that are just problematic here. I'm not saying they're wrong, they're just problematic. One is people oftentimes forget that by June the 19th, 1865, the war had been over for 2 months. Why were folks just showing up in Galveston then? I mean, that's one question. Number two, what did they tell them? Congratulations, you're free because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which technically is true because at the time the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, that area was under rebel control. Or did they say, you're essentially free, not only because of the Emancipation Proclamation, but because the Union won the war? It's a real interesting question. Now, we know they showed up and read the Emancipation Proclamation, but a real question we should ask is the Emancipation Proclamation what freed them? Is the Civil War what freed them? Or is the 13th Amendment really the thing that ended slavery in the United States? And we should be celebrating that as opposed to celebrating Abraham Lincoln. It's not that I don't like Abraham Lincoln. It's just that to act as though Abraham Lincoln was the man who freed all of the slaves for here on in, that's just bad history. So while I say absolutely we should have a Juneteenth holiday, can we please be a little critical about what's going on? Can we please ask questions? Can we do what Mike asked us to do, which is to say, okay, what's your theory of Juneteenth? Now put on your glasses and find some evidence for what's out there. That's the kind of thing I think that's fun. One, we can look backward and ask the question. And then, of course, we do have to ask what some folks have suggested, what some CRT people have suggested, which is, yeah, a new federal holiday is nice, but can we actually have some additional justice? Which then raises some extra questions. But like I say, that to me is the fun part. I want the discussion to be not around, hey, Juneteenth, end of slavery, but around what really was the end of slavery officially in the United States, and what does that say about how we do history? Because if you want to talk about a really complex guy, Abraham Lincoln was as complex as they get. So to narrow him down to, well, he split some rails and then he showed up in 1861 and then won the war and freed the slaves, that's just bad history, right? I would think that even a sixth grader can understand a little bit of nuance. I'm not saying we go all the way in, but even a sixth grader can understand so-and-so's not all bad and so-and-so's not all good. We can start thinking about that. That's what I want to see out of kids. So if critical race theory, or if critical thinking has managed to get its way into K-12, I think that's what we want.
Hank,
that's what we say we want.
I agree 100%, Hank. But I can see all kinds of problems with Tim Moore, white guy, showing up and doing that lesson. Well, let's think about Juneteenth. That's the white teacher saying that. And let's think about Lincoln. Let's think about 13th Amendment. Let's think about, so all the nuances that you describe, which are a really wonderful, that's a wonderful lesson. Can Tim Moore do that? Can Hank Chambers pull that off as an African American? It would seem to me, just the melanin or lack of melanin in our skins, this seems fraught with danger, that lesson that you've described, or am I too sensitive about race at that point?
You are right that it has to be packaged in the right way, and certainly depending on who I'm talking to, we're going to package it differently. So, for example, if I'm talking to a sixth grade class, I likely ask them to put themselves into that situation and to narrate what they see. What happened in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865? And wow, those soldiers got there 2 years later to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Wow, were those people free and they just didn't know it? We're going to ask the question a little bit differently, right? And we're going to have a little more fun. We're going to have fun. One, we're going to make it fun. You can't make slavery fun. Oh yeah, you can. You can. Well, no, you can't make slavery fun, but you can make history fun, even when it deals with some horrible things. At least where fun means that we learn some stuff, and at least where it means we're going to tell kids something that their parents may not know. So when they go home and talk to their parents, the parents will go, "Huh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way." Because I really want their parents to also think, well, what's Juneteenth about? Why do we do Juneteenth? And why is it really important for us to think about what it means to end slavery, not only in 1865, but what that then means today, right? So I'm going to use that as an entry point, and we're going to tell a story. And at the end of the story, we're going to be all right. And for folks who go, oh, that's a terrible story, that's awful. We sell Bambi to kids, and Bambi's mom gets shot in the first scene. Sorry for those folks who haven't seen Bambi. I apologize for the spoiler, but kids can handle certain things and still understand what's going on, recognizing that sometimes some negative things occur. Cinderella didn't get treated all that well, right? So I think we can do it because we're really good educators. But yeah, Tim Moore's not just going to walk in and say, I'm not sure about Juneteenth. Yeah, you're not going to do that. Right? And I'm not going to do that unless I want to lose the audience immediately and then get fired. I'm not cool with that. But we handle hard subjects all the time. The Civil War is a hard subject, right?
Right.
But we couldn't possibly teach American history without teaching the Civil War. We just couldn't do it, right?
I think
that's all I mean.
this is such a great lesson plan, because I think it teaches itself in some ways, because it's an opportunity to ask students, okay, why would someone who is self-identified as a conservative, why are they against Juneteenth? Why are critical race theorists or the progressive? Because it's out there. Why are they think this is not a good idea? And then why is the Biden administration patting themselves on the back so much about this? Like, explain those different reactions to this holiday, because I think it dives into different ways that you see, social change happening. I think it's a great lesson that maybe
Mike,
not.
It's just a way for white people to feel better. Let's be honest. It's just a way for white people. Oh yeah, look at the strides we're making. We're going to recognize Juneteenth, the holiday celebrated by African American families in Texas and other places for years, because they've known about this for years, and they've celebrated within their families for years. And now white people can feel better about making it a national holiday.
Wow, you take the prize on cynicism there, Mr. Kavanaugh.
No, Chris,
Critic of the year.
Chris has a great point, because I think I think there's a strong argument for 2021, yes. Right?
Chris is holding up Bambi.
Well, sorry, this is my other thing to Marxism. This illustrated, who did the illustrations in this?
Lenin?
No, some guy. I think his name was Whitaker something. Whitaker Chambers.
Okay. All right.
Sorry. Anyway, Michael.
You do raise a great point, because what Chris just said is in many ways very consistent with Derrick Bell's idea of interest convergence.
Yes.
And the notion, which is also somewhat similar, although a little bit different, but somewhat similar to Frederick Douglass's claim, power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Now, what Douglass is suggesting is you've got to demand things. What Bell is suggesting is you can demand all you want. You're not going to get it until the majority is cool with it.
Right.
Now, take that into 1963, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, where Martin Luther King starts talking about these issues, recognizing that the Letter from a Birmingham Jail, of course, is a response to a letter to the, essentially a letter to the editor written by 9 white clergy members in Birmingham saying, why don't you wait? That's a lesson plan that almost writes itself and allows us to go a long way back, move forward, and get into critical race theory in a way that allows us to then say, well, you're kind of right. That is to say, why did the folks in Birmingham deal? They dealt because they realized that the outside world was going to treat them as pariahs.
All right. So I no, and Mike, and maybe what you want to say can fit in, because in preparation for this, I engaged with an individual I've refused to engage with for years, but I thought, I'm going to do this because I know he's going to be the voice, all right, of real America. Here, I know it's California, but where I live is really not California. It's Oklahoma. They got lost in California. So he gave me 3 things. All right. First, he gave me, and this is from a very, very, well-known conservative foundation. He gave me this, the governor of Michigan, her Educator Advisory Council produced a report called Social Justice and Anti-Racist Resources that included an article in which the author says everything that happens today is racist, and the only question teachers and students can ask is how much racism was in play. That's his first piece of evidence of why he fears what's going on. Second, he goes to Buffalo,
New York. Let me ask you one question. Did he define his terms in terms of what he meant by racism? Because if by racism he means individual, then that's one thing. If by racism he means what the critical race theory folks say, which is structural, then yeah, okay, he's right. But he ought to put on his glasses. So
Right.
sorry, but go for it.
And again, that's where you and Mike have been consistent on that of individual versus, systemic there. And that might be too complex for a lot of people that are uncomfortable with this. The second source dealt with Buffalo, New York school districts. They had an emancipation curriculum that told children that all white people play a part in perpetuating systemic racism. All right. And again, I'm going to want all of you, if you feel like it, to respond to these three things. And his third argument I found, again, interesting. He says, because he's a man who's a little bit older than I am, and he says, for most of my life, I've been told that not to judge people by the color of the skin, by their race. All right. That race shouldn't matter, contrary to Cornel West, who wrote that race matters, that race shouldn't matter. And then he said, what about Martin? Because Hank, you talked about letter from Birmingham Jail. What about, this gentleman said, his I Have a Dream speech, in which our goal should be, I know you're going to laugh at that, but our goal should be to judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. He said this curriculum, this critical race theory, and I tried to tell them this is not necessarily critical race theory as understood in law school, but again, that was his argument, is that that the left wants everything to be about race. And we've been told for at least a generation, if not more, we shouldn't be thinking that way. And now we're confused. We're also afraid that we're going to be stepping on landmines. And this is we've just had it with the left. So how do you respond to either, one of those, two of those, none of those? Tim, you're ready to go.
Yeah. Well, I hear a lot of Kendi in this. There's a book has been recently published, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I read the book with on the suggestion of some dear friends. And his framework struck me, it was very provocative for me. In most of the book, I was angry, which may prove that I'm a white fragile. But I found his approach to be, I think it's a little ham-handed and inconsistent to say everything is about race. It's the zero-sum approach, I think, of Kendi is troublesome to me, because I think in a sense it's inconsistent with this insistence on intersectionality. If everything's about race, well, aren't there more nuances than that? And I know that I may be talking at an individual level here and not systemic, but I find these three things that you mentioned to sound a lot like what I believe Kendi is proposing in his book, and the part of the book that I found I don't know, troublesome, but I couldn't wrap my head around this totally bifurcated yes no zero sum approach to race. So that's what I kind of heard in two of those three statements that you made from your friend.
And I'm going to defer to Mike, or go ahead, Chris, and then Mike.
Well, and David, you hit on it by what you said, asking him or telling him that this is really not really about CRT, those things, because the idea of, with critical race theory is back, as we've said several times, it's about the structures, right? And it reminds me of the discussion we had before we started recording that, Ed O'Bannon should be thanking Lou Alcindor, right? Or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, sorry. Or, the idea that there are structures on top of structures on top of structures, and as we move forward, and people don't want to think that, well, I'm not racist. I don't have these bad feelings towards those people, right? But they don't understand that this is talking about the structures that have existed from the beginning of our country up to now. There are layers on layers, and we move forward built on these structures that it enables systemic racism. And it's not necessarily at an individual level, and unfortunately, people don't understand that.
Let me throw in an extra. I know we're about to go to Mike, and we're going to hit Mike in a moment. let me be a little clear about something. CRT folks would not give Black folks a pass. So let me just let folks understand. I recognize that in a number of ways, I would be considered to be a helper of the racist structure. You may say, whoa, pal, what are you talking about? Well, I live in a neighborhood that is arguably integrated. It's integrated because I'm here, right? But it's not terribly integrated. Why? Good schools, good public schools for my kids. What's the structure for that? Well, one is because we have property taxes that go into schools. We have PTAs, which can provide additional resources for kids. And as a consequence, what my wife and I can do is add a little bit more to what's already structurally there with the neighborhood school. Now, I recognize that I'm very fortunate. I'm fortunate because of the work I do. I'm fortunate because of the wages I make. But I'll recognize that structurally speaking, what I have done is moved into an area that will perpetuate the structure that will be problematic for most Black and brown people who are out there. CRT isn't going to say, well, hey, you're Black, so it's all right. But frankly, CRT doesn't tend to blame anybody for anything. You just say, well, okay, you're in the process of perpetuating what's going on, and you just need to understand what you're doing. I do, right? I understand that. So it's not just about telling white people, hey, white people. That's not what CRT is about. It's about describing what's out there and saying what you see is not precisely what you see. Just pull up the cover a little bit and you'll see racism underneath, because that's our original sin. And we haven't gotten away from it, right? When you hear neighborhood schools in a state or in a country that has historically had segregated housing, neighborhood schools packs a lot into that word, right? It just does. It doesn't mean that the person who likes neighborhood schools is a racist. It means that the structure says that you're likely going to find yourself in a lot of segregated schools if our housing is segregated, and we then build neighborhood schools and we say, go to your neighborhood school. I don't understand what the problem with that is. It just is. And maybe we want to change it. Maybe we don't. Maybe the fear is that the kids will become activists and say, I don't want to go to my neighborhood schools anymore. Well, if they say they don't want to go to the neighborhood schools because they want to learn from people who don't look like them, why is that a problem? Right? On the other hand, they may say, well, okay, I'm in these neighborhood schools now, but I'd like the next generation to not have it. What's wrong with that? If they say, we want to have funding that doesn't come from property taxes, we want it to come from the state as a whole so that every school has the same resources, what's wrong with that? Right? CRT doesn't tell them what to do. As Mike says, CRT doesn't tell you what to do. It just says, hey, here's the problem. You need to know where it came from. I don't understand why that's necessarily a problem, other than that people assume that their political outlook will somehow be attacked. Well, if your political outlook is better, then defend it. Don't tell me I can't teach kids about it. Sorry, Mike. I'll step down from my soapbox and give the soapbox to you. Go for it.
Oh, that's wonderful. And maybe it's just using the word race or racism and anti-racist. In our society, it's going to be toxic. There's a reason why, because what we're really talking about is privilege, it seems to me. Every society I study as a comparative political scientist, every society has different systems of privilege. Some societies, it's based on language. Some it's based on region. Some it's based on ethnicity, right? Some it's based on age, right? And I ask my students, mostly who are Americans, I say, okay, look at these different ways that we could privilege people in society, and you tell me what rings true. Is it better to be an English speaker or a non-English speaker? Is it better to be young or old? Is it better to be white or black? Is it better to be man or woman? What do you think? You've grown up in this society, and I don't think it's up for debate. I mean, I'm not carrying around white guilt or white male guilt. That's not what I'm trying to do as a teacher. But I have to at least become aware of the fact that I have some unearned benefits. And that's the first thing about privilege. It's an unearned benefit. My dad, who grew up in Bakersfield, used to tell me about how lucky I was because when he was a young man, he had to get a job and he had to pay for his first bike and he had to pay for his first baseball glove. And I didn't have to do that. And I had this vision of my dad as a hardworking man. He definitely was. My grandparents were hardworking people in Bakersfield, California. This is the 1950s. It wasn't until I got to graduate school that it rang true to me. I was like, wait, 1950s Bakersfield? My dad and his family, as poor as they were able to buy a house. And that house, that equity allowed my dad to go to college, which then allowed him to go to law school, which then allowed him to go back and practice law. And I reaped the benefits from all that. Now, I'm not going to ask my students to feel guilty about what their ancestors have done, but let's be real and let's recognize that the other factor of privilege is that it's relational. It's always coming at the expense of someone else. So the privilege I have as a white male came at the expense of females, and it came at the expense of homosexuals, and it came at the expense of Black Americans. To me, that's the first step. What we do about that, whether we make more holidays or whether we talk about reparations or whether we pass more civil rights laws, that's the next step. But can we just agree that there are some people in America that have more privilege than others and that it's historically rooted and that it's not my fault, but at least I should, at a university setting, I'm sorry, I'll be quick really here. In a university setting, the fact that I'm a white male and I walk into the classroom, empirically, I know I get student better evaluations than my white females, the Black females, and the Black male instructors with the same training. They empirically, student evaluations are not as strong. And there's evidence that says it comes back to gender and race. That's the institution we live in. That's the society we live in. Let's talk about it and move on. And isn't it just ironic that critical race theory, it's not ironic, it comes about 40 years ago in the 1970s, after 1968, when we finally, de jure, try to say everything's equal. And now let's really talk about the de facto inequalities. And we've been fighting this debate now for 50 years about what this means. So I'm sorry, I'm off my soapbox now. I'm done.
It's a great point. I mean, so for example, evals, right? The next question then becomes, what do you do with evals? We might say, Mike makes a great point. We've got to be really careful with how we deal with evals. Not that we're going to throw them away, but we're going to be careful with them, right? Maybe we're going to change when we ask the questions. Maybe we're going to ask at the beginning of the semester, middle of the semester, end of the semester. Maybe we're going to ask after the exam. Maybe we're going to, so we're going to figure this thing out and we're going to figure out what to do with it. Here is a piece where some folks complain, well, critical race theory tries to ignore merit. It's like, no, it tries to interrogate merit the way we interrogate lots of things. So, for example, we talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. That's awesome. But we all know baseball. We don't say Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. He was the first Black guy who had enough talent to play in the major leagues. No, we don't say that. We just go, well, okay, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier because Branch Rickey said, I'm breaking the color barrier, and because I want that guy who was good enough to be Rookie of the Year, I want that guy. And I'm in a situation where I'm allowed to get that guy. So I'm going to get that guy. And then exactly, money. And as a consequence, that's what happened. Now, think of it if the story were told differently. if the story were told among people who don't know baseball, Jackie Robinson was a pioneer because, wow, he came up from nothing and he learned how to play baseball. It's like, no, Jackie Robinson went to UCLA. Jackie Robinson was a vet. Jackie Robinson also didn't take a whole lot of crap from people, except when he had to, right? That's Jackie Robinson. And there were a lot of Jackie Robinsons who could have played in the major leagues, right? That's the story you tell, not the story of he was the first because, wow, finally a black man was strong enough to do that. In the same way that we shouldn't be telling stories about women who are first by acting as though there aren't a whole bunch of women who could have done the same thing. She was just the first who got the nod. Sandra Day O'Connor. Do we honestly believe that she was the first who could serve on the Supreme Court? Heck no. There are plenty of women who could have. They never got the chance. And to act as though we've discovered something new and to act as though, wow, she was the first who was qualified, that's nuts. What critical race theory and other things would do is say, can we just be honest about this and recognize the deal? And in the process also then, and I'll bring it to today, also get away from stupid things people say like, well, I want to take politics out of sports. The color line was politics in sports. So the concept that we're going to take politics out of sports, that's just dumb. And so I will say that anyone who says, I want to take politics out of sports, that's just dumb. Everybody else, cool. So, but I had to say that, which I realize is controversial, but really, we think sports is not about politics in some ways, right? Come on.
Well, as I thought, this issue, trying to do this within an hour was impossible. Just a couple of things there. Hank, you said, we got to teach the Civil War. I just need to remind you, especially given the state that you reside in, that it's the war of Northern aggression, all right, not the Civil War. Mike, thank God you don't want to impose guilt, because, especially if you get transferred to Oklahoma or Tennessee, because their statutes actually forbid the teaching of any subject matter that causes kids to feel guilty there. So, so just don't be doing that.
Are they closing all the Catholic schools?
Yeah, I know. That's what I was thinking. But in the last analysis, and I think there is a consensus here that the use of critical race theory is misplaced. It has enough of a technical feel to it and an academic feel that it makes it easier, I guess, to attack the left and the coastal regions. This gets back to where I opened up, and that is just a simple, I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word simple. A discussion about race has been difficult and continues to be difficult in this country, because this is really about who we are as a people and our schools and what do we teach. And critical race theory really has, I think it's a more of a distraction kind of thing politically there. We're supposed to include the First Amendment and instruction and teachers feeling like there's a chilling effect here. But I want to give you all a moment to maybe say one last thing. Professor Moore he has another appointment, is my understanding. So Professor Moore, do you have something you'd like to say in closing? You need to take off your mute button.
No, I don't have anything. I'm surprised I was able to contribute anything to this discussion, being a historian stuck in the 18th century. But no, I have nothing to add other than I've been given a couple more things to think about as I slog through life in regards to race. So thank you.
Mr. Kavanaugh.
I think this current kerfuffle over critical race theory, and it's just another, in a way, it's kind of like a boogeyman. It's just another wedge issue that people are using to try and kind of divide us up. And it's not teachers, good teachers have been teaching these ideas for years, and they're going to continue to teach many of these ideas in the very limited amount of time that they have to cover the expanse of American history in a critical fashion. So, the people that want to argue about it, I just ask them to define it. Can you define Marxism? can you define critical race theory? Can you tell me what these definitions are? And if they can't, then I'm not too worried about it.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for doing such a great job, David, of keeping us on track as usual.
Herding cats. It's herding cats today.
Yeah, as a university professor, this is not an easy terrain to sort of navigate. But I would encourage folks that to treat this theory as trying to help us answer questions. So we know that there's all these data points in terms of your likelihood to live in poverty, your likelihood to live to the age of 80, your likelihood to suffer from certain diseases. And we know in our society, a lot of those break down based on racial category. A lot of them do. So what I would encourage people watching this is just, it's in our interest. We should be curious about why that's the case. And critical race theory provides a way to get at that. There are other theories about how we can get at that. And I think they should all be equally sort of in our public discourse, because I think all Americans should have an interest in understanding why someone born in a certain neighborhood, white or black, has a less likelihood to, get to the American dream, as we call it, right? Let's, as Hank said, let's interrogate. He said interrogate merit. Let's interrogate these imbalances in our society with the hope that we can solve them. And I think if we do that with that sort of if that's what we're doing it for, then maybe a lot of this political, discourse around it that's fraught, maybe we can get around it. Probably not, but that's my hope.
Hank.
Let me just throw out just a couple quick things. One is, I hope that folks realize that when we're talking about critical theory, we're talking about history, and history is something that is just a fundamentally interesting thing to think about. I hope people also realize that we're talking about structures versus individuals when you're talking about CRT. And let me give folks an example, and I'll invite folks who hear this to do this. Think about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Now, to some people, they'd say they're all old, first four president, slave-holding Virginians. But if you go back and look at how they interacted with slavery, in fact, also add John Marshall to that group as well, another Virginian from the late 1700s, early 1800s. If you think about how they thought about slavery, they all thought differently about slavery. Right? There's a relatively new book about John Marshall that blows up the myth that he only had about a dozen servants in his life. No, he had hundreds. He bought and sold people relatively easily. That's different than how Jefferson approached it. It's different than how Madison approached it, and it's different than how Washington approached it. They were all different. So the reason why I throw that out is to say they had nuances back then. We have nuances now, but what we really ought to think about are structures, right? And ask, how did this get to be? Right? How did it get to be that we still don't have our first female president? How did it get to be that we had our first Black president after the election of 2008? How does it get to be that that highway is right there? How does it get to be that that high school seems to always have the best X program or Y program? How did it get to be that that high school is the rich high school? Asking those how did it get to be questions, once you do that, if you do that through a critical lens, you're going to find some interesting stuff. And I think that's one of the things that all of us as educators want our students to do. We don't want our students to just listen to us. We want our students to hear us and then go out and do their own thinking. That's what I got into education for. I can sit here and talk at people for a long time. But what I want them to do, particularly the kids who are going to be working hard to pay my Social Security, I want them to be thinking really hard about the best health care that I will get to enjoy, the best retirement I will get to enjoy. That's what I want them doing. So I just ask that folks say, fine, if you want to put critical race theory to the side, fine, but keep the tools from the toolbox. Keep the tools from the toolbox and we'll be all right. The kids will be all right at that point. They can handle it. They can handle it.
Chris, it was interesting what you said, and that is, this is just another boogeyman. And to a certain degree, I agree with you, but I'm a little bit nervous because, versus other historical wars, and you shared with me a great article from the New Yorker about that, I believe you did, this is manifesting itself in legislation.
It is.
Now, I'm retired, and so I don't got to worry about it. But I do have, family members who are educators, and it does worry me about this legislation. And is it going to have a chilling effect? And those kind of issues there. To our audience, let's, we want to give a specific thanks to Hank Chambers for joining us today. We will, of course, continue with our discussions here, and we look forward to another segment. Until then, have a good day. Where I'm living, it's 109 degrees right now. So I think I'm going to be, sitting outside and enjoying a glass of iced tea in the nice, cool weather. But see you soon, and same bad time, same bad place. Peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Thank you very much.
Have a good one, y'all.